So if you're just walking around the map of Pathologic without even any understanding of the game itself or what's going on here, probably the first thing you're going to notice is, well, the architecture. It's hard to describe with any technical or artistic terms other than weird. It's very much a patchwork of different styles, all with different purposes. And architecture does play a significant role in the plot of Pathologic as more than an aesthetic. However, for the purposes of this video, we're not going to enjoy the artistic value or the fantasy or the whimsy, I guess. This doesn't feel whimsical, but whimsical is the best word I can think of for it. In what I can only assume is Peter and Andres de Maten's greatest nightmare, we are going to see how some of the most interesting buildings of Pathologic measure up to the International Building Code. When playing as the Bachelor, your very first experience of the game itself is here, in the Stillwater loft. I'm playing as Artemy right now because I like him more, but we can see this fucking idiot. Hang on. Okay. So now that we've killed Daniel and taken his place, you can see that the Stillwater loft is pretty much this one big donut. The first thing we need to know about the International Building Code is that it classifies all buildings through a system of intended use categories, which are then used to specify what kinds of buildings certain codes and restrictions apply to. For the purposes of this video, we're going to put the Stillwater actually under Business Group B, which includes laboratories and observatories. Granted, as we can see, it is also a living area, given that Daniel sleeps here. However, the Stillwater does not count as a live workspace or a live/work building because of the fact that the non-residential area, the work area, is not on the first floor or the floor that's on the level of the grade plane. And also in Pathologic 2, more clearly, there is a giant telescope in the Stillwater loft, which makes that clearly a non-residential area. But given the fact that the second floor is the non-residential area, it is a business building rather than a live/work building. The first real challenge that any player runs into when they're playing as the Bachelor is the fact that you are seemingly stuck in this endless maze of one big circle from which you can never escape. Now, all of this is what's considered a common use circulation path in a business setting, which means that, first of all, this area needs to be better lit. The fact that you can't see the floor here is a hazard, given that we have a big circle and people could be working here. All of this floor space is part of the means of egress pathway. So yeah, first of all, this means of egress needs to be better lit. That's a code violation. Secondly, is the labyrinthine nature of this loft. You spend quite some time here before you realize that this is a door, which leads to an exit stairway. Now, the fact that this exit is not obvious and is in fact really hard to find, and this doorway is poorly illuminated, means that according to the International Building Code, a clear illuminated exit sign is necessary. Just a sign saying exit, so that you know you're not trapped in here forever. Now, to get down, we have to take this spiral staircase. This spiral staircase is not rated for use in a business building. This is not up to code as well. The fact that this spiral staircase is the only entrance or exit from the Stillwater loft is a violation of code. Each accessible story is required to have at least 2 exits. And each accessible story is also required to have at least 1 accessible means of egress, which means no stairs, and especially no spiral stairs. Another issue we run into is also when we come outside. This external stairway needs to be a ramp with handrails on each side. Speaking of handrails, this is another issue we're going to come upon in a lot of the buildings we talk about. Handrails are required on all sets of stairs. In Pathologic, there are no handrails. That's very simply, that's going to be how it is. I'm a little uncertain about this because we can't tell exactly how tall this is, but if this highest step is, I believe, 36 inches above the ground, there's also a requirement that there be a guard here to prevent falls. Another issue we run into that I haven't codified because it's a little uncertain here is the fact that absolutely all of the windows are covered, and just by looking at them, I wouldn't say that they are openable, which raises a ventilation issue, given that each accessible story needs to have ventilation. And since I don't see any air ducts within the rooms, that comes down to natural ventilation, and there doesn't seem to be adequate natural ventilation if these windows can't open. Our non-compliance list for the Stillwater is incomplete, but it's coming up to code 1104.4, code 1003.5, code 1006.3.2, 1008.2, 1009.1, 1013.1, and 1011.10 for the non-compliant spiral staircase. This is very clearly a residential area. Everything's pretty much up to code here. I have some concerns about these gates. Particularly, there's some requirements about the ways that gates open and whether they lock or not, but these gates don't seem to be locking, and we don't see them open or close at any point in the game. So I'm gonna just go and say that they're up to code. Here, again, we have an issue with the ramps. However, there are guards here, so that's nice. The particular code that references this issue with ramps specifically that we keep finding on the outside of doors is 1003.5. Because these doors are the only way into or out of these buildings, they're necessary exit discharge, and therefore they need to be fully accessible. Again, I'm not sure if these windows open. I feel like they probably would. Here's another concern of mine. I want to know if this is a balcony. It's kind of unclear to me. These sort of floor-length windows could potentially open out onto a balcony. This balcony does seem to be up to code with regards to its floor area in comparison with the floor area of the rest of the story. However, it would need to have a guarded rail around it. I don't have a lot of bones to pick with the Crucible because due to its classification as an R2 residential building, it is like a private residential building. It is exempted from a lot of the accessibility standards. So stuff like internal stairs are fine, and lack of handrail is fine. Yeah, so again, 1003.5, this is an assembly group A3 building, as it is technically a place of religious worship. And we're not going to spend much time talking about the building material classifications, but it is in category I, which means that it's just made of stone. And as far as fire concerns, it's not very flammable. There's this aisle here, which is very clearly seems to be more than 36 inches wide, which makes it just fine for our purposes. This area up here does have stairs, but given that this, I guess, theoretically is used as part of the religious ceremonies that theoretically would take place in here, and not as a general area for people, it's not required to be fully accessible. So the stairs are just fine. Here's where we start having problems, though. Again, spiral staircase. Spiral staircases are only permitted for use in dwelling units or in production staging areas. This staircase is also extremely poorly lit, which makes it in violation of 1008.2. Yeah, so then we have this area up here. Again, there really should be guards here, because I definitely could just fall off there, and I'm kind of scared I might. This story is not accessible, which makes it in violation of the code, because of the spiral staircase thing, the fact that it is a staircase, the lack of handrails. However, there are 2 exits from this story, one on each side, which is a very good design and makes it, that aspect of it is up to code. This is also one of the taller buildings in the game, but given that it's A2 and it is in material category I, it seems like the height is probably just fine. It's hard to find requirements surrounding buttresses, which are these big braces coming out of the side. It's hard to find regulations on those in the code, probably because they're not generally in use in contemporary architecture. But they do seem to be compliant with the fire code as protrusions. It looks like they're made of metal, which is not flammable, if you didn't know that. So that's your cathedral. The cathedral is probably one of the more alright buildings in the game, because it's a cathedral. If I had to describe it, I would say it's a cathedral and there's a clock on top. Yeah, it's one of the more up to code buildings in the game. The only place it really falls short is as far as accessibility, and I think spiral staircases are also a hazard concern, and the lighting in the staircase is not very good. But a lot of those are more period concerns. Like, we don't, as intentionally ambiguous as Pathologic is with the time period it takes place in, I don't think that it would be very much in keeping with the world building to see an elevator. So this is a pretty funky building. Just from looking at it, this needs to have a ramp. And here we are in the theater. Okay, so First thing I notice is there's this other door that is not interactable, but I guess we'll count that as, we'll count that as a second exit. This stage is up to code. The one thing is I'm not sure whether this sort of gallery area is intended as an audience space, in which case there would need to be a ramp there instead of stairs. But, we'll be nice. We'll say that this is just part of the performance area. In which case the audience area is totally fine. And the stairs on the stage are just fine as well. I think I mentioned that spiral staircases are permitted in technical staging areas. I'm not really sure if I would count the upper levels of the theater audience area as, or technical staging areas. Typically I wouldn't, but given the particularities of the theater in Pathologic, I'm just gonna go ahead and say that these spiral staircases are just fine. There are 3 levels here, which again seems fine. There's only 1 exit per level, which is another issue of inaccessible stories, and they're lacking the required means of egress staircases that they would need for emergencies. However, there are notably there are guards and railings on the upper levels, so that's good. Thanks, Mark. We had a good time. Now, this is a little bit of an odd one. This wasn't particularly built by anyone, but I do want to come here to the Dilapidated Shack just to give fucking Vlad Jr. just a little bit of trouble. Okay. First of all, Vlad. This is, unlike the Stillwater, classified as a live/work area, given that he's got his shitty little cot in the corner over there, where he cries himself to sleep at night, I assume. And he also works here, as you can see from the stuff. There are some particular requirements that apply to live-work areas. You freak. Again, we're seeing an issue with ventilation in this room more than ever before, really, because he has boarded up all of the windows so that no one will see him secretly digging a well. This area's generally pretty well lit. However, the light seems to be coming from nowhere, apparently. And in Pathologic 2, the Dilapidated Shack is very clearly poorly lit. And that is an issue. Yeah, so I genuinely would mark the Dilapidated Shack as 1204.1 non-compliant. Now, obviously, lighting and ventilation aren't the most interesting things about this area. The most interesting things about this area are the well and the man who should fall into it. Yeah, the thing about this well is that it has access to a network of tunnels. I'm going to be a little bastard, and I'm going to classify those as pedestrian tunnels, which means that technically this well is one of the exits and the means of egress from the Dilapidated Shack. However, there's a problem with that, which is the fact that the pedestrian tunnel is completely inaccessible, and access to and from pedestrian tunnels, regardless of other accessible routes in or out of a building, needs to be accessible. There's also an issue, which is the fact that the way in and out of the pedestrian tunnel via the haunted well is exclusively a ladder, which isn't set up right now. but is the permanent means of access to the tunnels, which is not up to code. Ladders cannot be set up permanently. We also, again, want to look at this space as a live-work area. That's better. The issue with that being, again, that the non-residential areas of a live-work building need to be accessible. And the means of egress to and from them, given that the tunnels below are also not only pedestrian tunnels, but they are part of the non-residential part of the live-work area, need to be accessible, and they're not. And the lack of lighting that we've established also makes this whole non-residential area, which is everything except for his shitty little bed that he sleeps in at night, all of it's inaccessible, and none of it's up to code. And he owes me $2 million. And that's the Vlad Jr. story. Hello, little boy. No, this isn't the broken heart. Is it? Is this the broken heart? I don't think this is the broken heart. This is not the broken heart. Here we are at the broken. Now, there's not a lot going on with the broken heart, really. The really interesting thing is the flood danger. Because as you can see here, the water is right here. And in fact, the pub itself is below the level of the river that's right next to it. Yeah, basically under no circumstances is it advisable to even have a basement here, much less use the basement as a place of business. Because there's probably literally water right on the other side of that foundation. And come flood season, the water has to rise 3 feet total before it starts coming down here. I have to restart that sentence because I accidentally looked at a picture of a naked girl, and I don't think I can put that on YouTube. Building an exterior exit to a basement that's below the water level of a river it's right next to on a floodplain, essentially, is a really bad idea and is against the code. Now, the other thing is, once again, we're having an issue with ventilation. The Broken Heart is underground. It has one little door. It has no windows. Thanks. So, as an aside, I think I saw some people say that they were interested in looking at the termitary. We're not going to look at the termitary. I haven't done any reading into the termitary. What I can tell you about the termitary is that it's bad. It's not good in there. People don't like it in there, and it's not safe. All right. We're coming up to the finale of our little tour. And before we get to the big hog, we're going to talk about the little hogs, which are these here. Stairways to Heaven, also built by Peter Stamatin. All of these structures, for our purposes, are classified under Assembly Group A5, which includes bleachers and grandstands and amusement park rides. Yeah, there's only one way down from the highest point, which is a means of egress issue. These stairs are a problem, regardless of the fact that they're stairs and there's no alternative. It's a play structure, which means that it's okay that they're stairs. Play structures on playgrounds, play areas for children are not required to be accessible. However, they do have the same handrail requirements that every single other building has failed to live up to. And once again, there are no handrails here. Given that these are very clearly more than 36 inches tall, I would also suggest that there be guards implemented here, as in to stop children from falling off. The maximum height of the vertical rise between landings is 12 feet. And this, probably looking at it, is right around that area. Now, the next concern is the landing itself. You can tell from how scary it is to navigate them, they're not up to code. The landing is required to be at least 48 inches long, parallel to the direction of travel. And it's very clearly not. But there's your stairways. These are similar to the Cathedral, Class I material. It's not flammable. That makes it, in a lot of ways, these stairways are a lot less of an issue than the Polyhedron, but still a huge issue. Another thing to note as we talk about fire safety is that none of these buildings have sprinklers. I didn't go through and dock every single non-compliance in the fire safety section because I don't get paid for this. And also because I don't get paid for this, I didn't try to go through and surmise whether various walls are reinforced or what sort of mortar is used. There's a lot of stuff about that, what kinds of mortar you can use, like calculations about how big the windows gotta be. I didn't do any of that. We're keeping it simple. We're cutting them a lot of slack in this town on Gorkin. We're being very, very kind, ultimately. And they're still really fucking it up. As you can imagine, the Polyhedron was the biggest issue for me in terms of determining an intended use category. I made some posts on Tumblr asking people to tell me what they thought the Polyhedron was, supposed to be used for, because in the game it's full of kids, it's full of souls, but it wasn't meant to be full of kids, so it's a little unclear. People had some really hot takes about Peter Stamadin's vendetta against God and stuff, and I don't think I made it clear enough that I was just trying to figure out whether it's a place of business or a hazardous material storage site. But ultimately I did come to the conclusion that the Polyhedron is in storage group S2. The reason for this being that it was built to store miracles, souls, one soul at least, and maybe ideas. And I don't think that any of those are hazardous. However, despite its intended use as a storage building, the Polyhedron is home to 1,600 children. Over 1,000 children. And that is something that we're gonna take into account. So as far as occupancy, like, in terms of, like, concerns about occupancy, exit capacity, stuff like that, we are going to classify it as a daycare. The Polyhedron is a daycare warehouse with a very good defend-in-place protocol, which is, of course, giving guns to kids. One of the other interesting things about the Polyhedron is that it is made of its own blueprints. Here's another landing. This landing isn't up to code. Blueprints aren't
a building material that has, per se, been approved by the International Building Code.
Now, the first thing that we're going to bother the polyhedron for is height. You may have noticed that I've been pretty unclear, uncertain about the height of buildings that we've talked about. You know, the Stairway to Heaven, the Cathedral. It's hard to judge height. However, there is a really useful tweet where someone has stacked like 42 to 45 models of Reuben on top of each other until they reach the full height of the polyhedron to get a sort of measure of how tall it is. And the conclusion that we can come to from the fact that it takes over 41 and a half Reubens to reach the top of the polyhedron is from the grade plane to the tip of its tippy spire. I think that the polyhedron is more than 160 feet tall, which is a code violation. The other thing I want to talk about with regards to height is the vertical rise between landings. Thanks to the Reuben ruler, I can safely see that the vertical rise to this first landing is about 6 Reubens, when again the maximum allowable vertical rise is probably about 1.5 Reubens. Again, we're facing the problem, which is that there's no guards here. There's no handrails. I think we're more than 36 inches above the ground. The stairs are also in violation of 1005.3.1, which is an issue because the stairs are too narrow for its occupancy. Again, over 1,000 children live here. This is a daycare, and 1,000 children aren't going to be able to get down those stairs without some of them falling off, especially since there are no guards, which is in violation of 1015.2. I'm uncertain about 1204.5 and 1008.1. It may be compliant with those, or it may be in violation of those. Those have to do with means of egress lighting. We've talked about that a little bit before. I'm not sure that the lighting provided by the polyhedron to these exterior stairs is enough to hold up to the code. Now, there's also regulations that we haven't talked about until now regarding number of stories, like stories as in a building, and like how many stories you can have. The issue with that in this case is that we don't really know how many stories the polyhedron has. I wouldn't consider these massive landing stories. The polyhedron stories are kind of non-linear and confusing. It also becomes a problem when we try to look into regulations surrounding the square footage of stories. It's hard to say. There really is no saying how big each story is. However, we can see this sort of what I would call a lobby. And we can see this, I suppose it's a landing. It's almost a balcony. And if we were to classify it as a balcony needs to be 50% or less of the square footage of the story that it's connected to, which would be this story. And it seems to be pretty much as big as the story it's connected to. Again, it also needs guards and rails along the edges, which it does not have. Oh, the fact that the polyhedron is, again, made of its own blueprints, it's not an approved material, puts it in violation of 705.2.2, 602.5, 705.4, 1403. There is some regulations in place that outline the testing of new materials, but I think it's safe to assume that an advisory board has not been here to make sure that this building is structurally sound. To that extent, I'm just going to go ahead and say
that this building as a whole is 1616 non-compliant in that it lacks structural integrity, because I don't know anything about architecture, but I know that this lacks structural integrity. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about with the polyhedron is the foundations, and we pretty much laid off talking about the foundations of everywhere else except, the Broken Heart to a small extent, because we don't know much about them. But with the polyhedron, we definitely do know more than a little bit about its foundations as they come up in the plot. You may not be surprised to learn that the foundations of the polyhedron would be classified as a deep foundation, given that they extend 200 meters into the earth. But it turns out that there are actually quite a few regulations regarding the installation and nature of deep foundations. Particularly, there's only a few approved materials for a deep foundation to be made of. Pretty much like steel, concrete, and even if the foundation of the polyhedron in Classic is made of this sort of rock material, it doesn't seem to be concrete or steel or any of the other approved materials. The installation of a deep foundation also requires a sort of geological survey, which means a small subterranean exploration of the area that's going to be excavated in order to install the foundation, which I can assume they didn't do. Based on the plot of Pathologic. If it wasn't already clear, the building with the most International Building Code violations is, of course, the polyhedron. And that brings us to the end of this little walking tour, this little walking flying tour. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, tell me I'm wrong about everything. I probably am. Defend the stomatans. Read the... Oh my god!